Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? I am delighted to be here with you tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. You guys hearing me okay in the back? Yes. Okay, fabulous. So, let's get started. I'm doing double duty here, so I'm trying to keep up with where I am. So, all right. So, this is Stephen Hawking, who you heard about just a moment ago. And he said, success in creating AI, or artificial intelligence, would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last, unless we learn how to avoid the risks. So there are some very smart people, including Bill Gates and Elon Musk and others, who are seriously concerned about what the potential is for artificial intelligence and what it could do to us as much as what it could do for us. So, what is artificial intelligence to start? So artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, translation between languages. You'll see these themes recur, because what we're really talking about is the ability for computers to move beyond what they traditionally do, which is largely pattern matching, and beginning to do actual generalization. So not just repeating what they've seen 100 times, but being able to come up with an answer when they're presented with a 101st scenario that they haven't actually seen. It's also related to the similar task of using computers to understand human intelligence, but it doesn't have to confine itself to methods that are biologically observable. And so we'll see that come up a little bit later when we start looking at how computers are actually learning to talk to each other and create languages of their own. So the origins of artificial intelligence. Now, how many of you think artificial intelligence is something that's been around for maybe a decade or so? Anybody? Any hands? Up there, 20 years? Up there, 30? 40? Okay, well actually the origins of artificial intelligence began in 1955. Wow. There was actually a proposal that was put together for some research by this gentleman, John McCarthy from Dartmouth. He's now at Stanford, I think. They put together essentially to examine artificial intelligence as finding how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and basically the problem is taken to be that of making a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human were so behaving. The interesting thing, and part of the reason why, and these are the guys actually, some of them, this was at their 50th reunion of the conference that they held back in 1956. But I bring that up largely because I think it's important to recognize the huge evolution that computers in particular, but artificial intelligence specifically, have undergone in this 60-year period. This isn't something that just because we have fast computers, it's suddenly coming to the fore. But the fact that we have much faster computers and we have things like the internet and neural nets and all these types of things have actually made the capacity for progress much greater. A lot of the theoretical frameworks and a lot of the initial research was done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and before, but we're starting to see that actually come into consumer-driven capacity, in large part because of the availability of high-capacity computing, a lot of it, frankly, in your pocket. So what are people afraid of? Well, we'll start with this one. Anybody recognize that? Hal. Okay, Hal. Sorry, Dave, I can't do that. So Hal was one of the early dystopian computer voices, and essentially people are afraid that the computers are going to, in some way, inhibit us from doing something that we're supposed to do, are going to actually end up killing us as they try to save us. And this, people argue about whether Hal's actually doing this intentionally, whether he's programmed to be evil, but in any respect, it basically creates this fear of, well, what if the machine can control the environment we live in this case, a spacecraft, and we can't undo it? The other thing that people worry about is, anybody know what this one is?
War games.
War games, very good. All right, so war games, the computer is actually very childlike. It just thinks it's a game, right? It's tic-tac-toe. It's a game. And so there's this sort of question about unintended consequences that, that we run up against. And we'll see some of that in just a second. And then you'll recognize tonight's star. And one of the concerns that people have, that people worry about there, is this notion of, well, what if they become human-like? What if they have emotions or feelings? You can't shut them off if, like Data on Star Trek or whatever, if they are sentient to some extent. And of course, people are just worried they're going to kill us, which is always one of the fun things that movies get made much more about that. But seriously, when we start to look at when we start to look at the concerns, oops, I got to get these synced up here. They're really afraid of superintelligence. This idea that the computers are going to learn, and because they can learn, they're ultimately going to become more sentient, more knowledgeable than we are. And the issue there is obviously the bad intentions of the creator. Somebody actually decides to create a computer to do bad things, to kill people. That's the trope from a lot of movies, most of the Marvel Avengers movies, right? Somebody creates this big thing in the sky that's going to kill us because they're bad dudes. And if you can't outthink the machine, or you can't outrun the machine, or you can't outwit the machine, you're toast. And so there is, and if you've seen anything with computers, if you've had any interactions with robots, stuff breaks, stuff goes off the wires. And so the question of if you intend to do bad things, that obviously has a huge downside potential. So, if you want unlimited intelligence, you'd better figure out how to align computers with human needs. The second issue is unanticipated bad behavior. There's a thought experiment called the paperclip maximizer, where it says, what if you had a device that said its job is to make as many paperclips as it can, and it needs to harvest the resources to do that? When you think, well, cool, we'll end up with a lot of paperclips. But as it keeps going, what happens if it runs out of the original wire that it needs? Well, now it goes foraging, or now it decides, well, really what we need are atoms, and y'all are atoms, so we're just going to repurpose your atoms to make more paperclips. And you say, whoa, well, what if we just said, well, only make 1 million paperclips? Well, then you make 1 million paperclips, but it says, wow, do I need to make sure I have 1 million paperclips? So now I need to create a system to count the many paperclips, and now I need all the resources to do that. So there's this whole notion of suddenly the thing we intended, and Lord knows we live in the world of unintended consequences. If you are in medicine or law or justice or business, there are lots of unintended consequences. And so when you give something that's potentially sentient the ability to go in a lot of different directions, the impact could be pretty horrific. The corollary to that is that we just happen to be in the way. It may not intend. So when you build a house, you don't intend to kill all the bugs and disrupt the ecosystem and all that sort of stuff, and yet it just sort of happens because we're working at a level of a sort of a macro level of understanding where the universes for the bugs or the grass or whatever are working at a different level. Conceivably, computers, sentient computers could do the same thing. You just happen to be the source of atoms, or you just happen to be the thing that's standing in the way of the goal that they are programmed to do. And again, if that's an intentionally bad goal, like wipe out the people, or it's a not intentionally bad goal, like reduce carbon emissions by getting rid of the people. So there's some real questions about how you do that. You may just happen to be in the way. And finally, so computers do what we tell them until we can't tell them what to do. So that's really one of the things that people are concerned about. And then the one that we are dealing with actually today more and more is the whole question of automation and economic disruption. If you look at a lot of the economic analysis that's gone on recently, one of the biggest issues that we've been wrestling with is actually not as much offshoring in manufacturing as much as it is automation. So when the GM plant was here, we had 3,000 people working in the GM plant. Today, my guess is we would probably have significantly fewer of those folks, and their skills would be very different because there would be robots and there would be automation that was involved in producing the same capacity. That's actually already happening today, and there are some concerns across the economy about what that really means. There was a piece in India not too long ago where, which is famous for its software programming and engineers and stuff like that, where the government was concerned that they weren't going to be able to retrain all of these software engineers in the next level of development, and because automation had essentially wiped out a lot of the jobs that they were doing at the entry-level programming. So it's a global problem, and it is something that we will have to figure out how to wrestle with. So that one's closer to your doorstep than the Terminator. So why aren't some people afraid? Well, one problem with AGI is artificial general intelligence dystopias is they project a parochial alpha male psychology on the concept of intelligence. So what does that mean? Essentially, it's telling that many of our techno-prophets can't entertain the possibility that artificial intelligence will naturally develop along female lines, fully capable of solving problems with no burning desire to annihilate innocence or dominate the civilization. So some people are like, well, as long as you're not trying to be bad, and as long as we take precautions, we could probably handle this thing. So we shall see. Just for the record, there's a lot more of the other guys than this guy, but he's out there, so you get what you get. Okay, so I thought as we look at sort of where we are in AI today, I'd break it down into a top 10 list, 5 reasons that AI will take over the world, and then 5 reasons that it might not take over the world, at least not right away. So the first thing is Moore's Law. So Moore's Law, there's a guy by the name of Gordon Moore who worked for Intel, and he created an axiom that says that computers will double in speed and power every 18 months. Let that settle in. Double in speed and power every 18 months. Okay, anybody ever do that thing in grade school where you did, I'll pay you $10,000 or I'll pay you a penny a day and double it for a month? Anybody ever do that? Yes, no, vertical head nod, yes. All right, so what happens, right, is that the payoff comes at the end. Because what you're dealing with is an exponential expansion rather than arithmetic expansion. So when you think about it from this perspective, it's on target since the 60s. So since the 60s, computers have become 2 to the 33rd power, or 8,589,934,592 times more powerful than they were in 1965. Okay? This didn't exist 10 years ago. This thing is more powerful than the computers that went to the moon. This thing is more powerful than the space shuttle. Okay? In terms of raw computing power. The capacity to do the stuff it can do is so incredibly beyond our capacity in some ways to even comprehend. And yet, it's going to be twice that number 2 years from now. And that's going to continue. And there was, just to geek out for a second, there was an issue about the limits of silicon and could they put that many transistors on. Now they're looking at quantum computing that opens up and things like putting computing in DNA and stuff like that, that actually opens up entirely new realms for this to keep going. To sort of factor that into what we're talking about here. So because of the computing capacity, all right, your brain works at about 100 meters per second, right, the firing. All right, computers are like thousands of times faster than that because they can operate almost at the speed of light, all right, because you're looking at moving atoms around. So AI could think about the world at speeds many orders of magnitudes faster than our brains can. Okay, stay with me on this one. All right, so a subjective year of thinking would be accomplished for every 31 physical seconds. All right, so your year of thinking, a computer can do in 31 seconds. An entire millennium of thinking is 8.5 hours. So basically, in a work week, a computer could think every thought that for a millennium. Okay? So the capacity to do the kinds of things we're going to talk about is already there. The issue is how do you structure the mechanics to be able to do that? So that's number one. Number two, many of you probably familiar with our friend's speech recognition. You may recognize Siri, or now with Google Home, and we have Amazon Alexa. This week we also had Bixby. So the key thing about voice speech recognition is that you're liberated from this, okay? But it's also the ability to be able to understand and process commands. So natural language processing, speech recognition is the window into natural language processing. And I think when I don't know if that's a selling point or a caution or a threat, but your Alexa there is certainly getting smarter because, again, we're still in the pattern matching. Your voice becomes a pattern, it matches the pattern, and the more it hears, the more patterns it can match. So what speech recognition leads us to then is natural language processing, which means that now that I understand the speech, I can do something with it. And you may have heard about a computer called IBM Watson. You may have seen Jeopardy, where it won Jeopardy. And you're saying, oh, Jeopardy, great, game show, sure. The thing with Jeopardy, and part of the reason it's interesting is because how does Jeopardy work? Anyone? You get the answer and you have to provide the question. Okay? So for a computer to do this, it has to understand, not only hear what Alex Trebek is saying, but it has to understand, and then it has to reverse engineer it and put it in the frame of a question, all before the human can press the button. Okay? I don't know if any of you saw this, but looking at the numbers there, Watson kicked butt. Okay? And so this was a huge leap forward because what it did was it essentially provided interpretive capacity. All right, now, Watson has like petaflops, like lots of data that it can sift through very, very quickly. So this is where that computing power thing comes into play. It can sift through every recorded text since the history of man, and it was able to do it in a time frame that was sufficiently consistent with the humans. Okay, so that's great. They can go on Jeopardy and nobody has to win anymore. That's nice. But what it allows us to do now is it allows us to do things like healthcare, because it allows us to, for you, and they're doing this actually up at the Cleveland Clinic right now and at Mayo, they're doing some work where they're essentially providing diagnoses to people with cancer. And they're saying, hey, here's all the clinical trial data that have been done on these things. Here are the 3 options that are available to you based on the clinical trial data that we think is going to work for you, and here are the side effects and all that kind of stuff. So theoretically, you could get to the point where you could interrogate the computer, or the computer could interrogate you, and then be able to provide you with some diagnosis and prescription. Again, largely based on the pattern matching component of this. All right, Watson isn't sort of doing the stethoscope stuff, but it's basically taking the data and crunching it. But natural language processing allows them to do that without having to do all the keystrokes. Okay, next thing, games. Okay, maybe remember this? Deep Blue, 1997. Gary Kasparov obviously didn't do well. And so a computer beats man at chess. Woo! All right, pretty exciting stuff. Chess, again, is one of those games where there's a lot of, there are like games. You can say, I'm going to play the Manchurian move or whatever. And so there's a whole set of different patterns that you can learn to be able to do it. And essentially it involves recognizing the board to be able to do that. Just recently, Google had a computer called AlphaGo, where they were trying to beat somebody at Go. So this guy over here, this Korean Lee Sedol, he is the world Go champion. And Go is basically you're trying to flip over as many of the, you want to end up with more of your color on the board than the other guy. And you essentially have to put, anytime you create a straight line, you can flip them over and all that sort of stuff. So the goal was they were putting $1 million on the table, and it was best out of, I think it was best out of 5. And the computer won 4-1. And I mean, the guy going in, he's like, it'll be 4-1, and they'll be mopping the floor with this thing when we're done, kind of thing. And they crushed him. What was interesting about this is, again, there's not as much of there's more strategy here than just whereas chess you actually have sort of, played moves. These are more strategic. So it's the way they frame it is it's like a marketplace kind of game, and you're willing to lose so much to gain so much. And the interesting thing about it, more than the fact that AlphaGo won 4 times, was that actually Lee won once. And what he was able to do was he was able to basically, you ever see, since we're doing movies, a movie reference, Hunt for Red October? He pulled a crazy Ivan. He basically said, "Oh yeah, well I'm going to go down swinging," and the computer went, "What?" Because they hadn't seen that, and so the computer ended up actually losing and making some mistakes because they hadn't seen that sort of non-linear approach to playing the game. Poker. This one just happened recently. Carnegie Mellon created this, and 2 years ago they went up against these guys and lost big time. So 2 years later, they played 120,000 hands, and they won $1.8 million. And the thing about poker is there's no pattern to it necessarily, and you have to be able to gauge the uncertainty that comes from people bluffing, people playing cards they shouldn't play, just being stupid, as well as being thoughtful and interesting about it. And so there's some real question about that, but they crushed them. 120,000 poker hands, and they did it really well. Okay, so getting here going. Machine learning, self-driving cars, you may have heard about this. So now we're getting to the point where the more computers are doing stuff, the more they're learning about how to do it. And so they're actually teaching themselves by doing it. Self-driving cars, that's what's happening here. Google Translate, they basically started using artificial intelligence to translate Japanese into English, and people noticed it because the translations became so much more effective once they started being able to basically crank huge amounts of Japanese through the system and huge amounts of English. And all these translations, they were actually able to teach the machine to improve itself through translation. And the reason the guys are holding a little picture, that's actually a cat picture, because they taught the computer taught itself to recognize a cat, which seems like, duh, any 2-year-old can do that. But the fact that without prompting, without saying, this is a cat, go find one, by showing them lots and lots and lots of pictures of cats and stuff like that, they were actually able to teach the computer to recognize a cat as a cat. Similar thing here just happened recently. They're able to recognize objects in video, saying, this is a tiger in the video. Again, without prompting, saying, what's in the video? Is it a cat? Is it a big cat? Is it a big cat with stripes? Basically being able to say, okay, here's all of this data about stuff in the universe. I have to be able to recognize what that thing is, so I have to be able to parse not just the pixels, but I have to put it in context, and then I have to be able to associate that contextual clue with the data itself. And then bot language, and this is what I was talking about earlier. They've done some experiments where they've actually had computers create their own language by teaching each other what stuff means. So if you've ever seen The Miracle Worker, where Annie does that, it's basically the bots teaching each other, this is yes, this is no, and they've actually developed languages that they can speak doing that. So again, kind of freaky stuff, but so that's where we are. Okay, so now that you're all sufficiently freaked out, 5 reasons why AI won't take over the world. I love this cartoon. I'll just give you a minute to read it. Okay, so clearly, if there's nothing else, we can turn them off, right? So one of the interesting things, reasons why, is this notion of variety. This is actually something, a report that McKinsey & Company did about the level of automation around the world in a variety of different business sectors. So you see food service up there, manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, etc. The gray bars over on the, I can actually use this here. The gray bar here is the potential for automation in that particular sector. The gray versus blue here is how much automation there's actually been done thus far. So you can see that there are certain areas where they don't really think there's going to be much in the way of automation. Conversely, there are other places where it's like, whoa, don't want to be working in mining. And so I think the challenge here is that there are going to be lots of things that we do that it's going to be difficult for computers to ultimately do. Just the robots, the things like that. There are going to be aspects of it, but doing the whole job is going to be difficult. I would like to think, in my own defense, that this would be difficult for a robot to do, but time will tell. Complexity. So this is an economic map of Ireland. Okay, gosh, lots of stuff there. One of the things that computers are really good at doing is doing single things, so you can teach them to play. AlphaGo can kick your butt at AlphaGo, but it can't play chess. The Deep Blue could play chess, but it couldn't, write music. So there's this notion of specificity, and when you look at the complexity of the kinds of things that we do as humans, not just the economy of Ireland, the idea that a computer could be able to, even with all its processing power, even with all that sort of millennium in a week sort of stuff, it's still hard to imagine that you can get to a level of capacity that overcomes the complexity that we deal with every day. Ambiguity and intentionality. What are these people saying? I don't know. Irony, sarcasm, all sorts of stuff that we as humans have figured out or not figured out, depending on where you are on the nerd spectrum, to be able to work out. These are the types of things that computers are inherently bad at doing. And because so much of it is based on prior situations, prior patterns, looking at videos, looking at pictures and stuff like that, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine that they would be able to handle ambiguous situations. Is it yes, is it no? I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Becomes a real challenge when you're looking at, especially in terms of human interaction. Creativity. Friends of mine have a definition of creativity that's the interplay between ability and process by which an individual or group produces an outcome or product that is both novel and useful as defined within some social context. The key things there are novel and useful. All right, so again, computers at this point are doing what we tell them to do. We still have the capacity to tell them. So, as I used to say about the internet, everything's on the internet except what isn't, right? If nobody likes Jane Austen's not on the internet, right? It's because somebody has to actively put it there. And the same thing is true with creativity. If we don't enable machines to do some level of creativity, we run the risk of just simply having them be focused. And humans can create our way out of it. The end result of almost every single sci-fi movie where the robots lose is we outthunk them. So that's the creativity thing. So eventually, self-driving car will outperform human drivers. So we can say that along one dimension, AI is super intelligent. But we also might say that it's an idiot savant because it cannot do anything else, like recite a poem or solve an algebra problem. So there used to be something, well there is something, called the Turing test. Alan Turing, have you ever seen The Imitation Game? Another great movie. He came up with this idea of that essentially if you could get a computer to have a conversation with you that made sense and sort of made you believe it was a human, that was sort of the initial test for artificial intelligence. That's how we knew we sort of passed that barrier. It's not like some evasive chatbot that says, "Oh, I don't know. What do you think?" Or be like your therapist, right? Well, how's that make you feel? No, it has to actually really have the conversation with you. They've created now this new test called the Lovelace test. It is based on Ada Lovelace, the 19th century mathematician, not Lorna Lovelace, so just no movie references there. But the idea is that with the Lovelace test, it's about can you ask a computer to, I want to see a cat climbing the Empire State Building in boots in the rain on the 4th of July. And being able to essentially compress all of those references and meld them into something that is unique. And there are programs, there were a couple out on the internet a couple years ago where you could sort of talk to it and it would come up with really freaky kind of like, death metal posters of what was in your head. But the idea is that the ability to actually create that novel and useful thing in a social context is really the essence of creativity. And that's one of the areas where, at least for right now, we are still being successful. And then this notion I call multiplicity, and that's this idea that we are able to multitask. We are able to do a lot of different things at the same time. Computers are generally not really good at doing that. In fact, there's a company called Kindred today where they actually have sort of robot teachers, and when they're trying to have robots do things like pick up eggs or not crush packages or stuff like that, and when they run into situations they're not sure of what they do, there's actually a human who comes in and basically manipulates the thing to show them how to do it. So in a lot of ways, I think those kinds of experiences are going to continue. And what we're seeing with a lot of robotics, not necessarily artificial intelligence, but robotics, is that it's actually augmenting individuals. This is actually like a suit that NASA created to help people walk who are exoskeleton kinds of stuff. They can lift thousands of pounds or whatever. And I don't know what he's doing with that. Flapjacks, who knows? But it's just there. So anyway, so there is between variety, complexity, and ambiguity. It's all the mushy stuff that we have a hard time doing. We have an easier time doing. The computers have a hard time moving from that pattern matching to generalization. And then finally, I thought this was a great way to end this. This is for Albert Einstein, that the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge but imagination. And I think at the end of the day, my money's on us, on the creativity side, and that eventually we'll be able to either think our way out of it or just run faster, or eventually they'll unplug from the wall and we'll be okay. Questions? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to talk about Alan Turing a little bit more. I know he's prominent in the movie we're about to see, and for people that don't know, he helped break some of the German codes from World War II. He was very prominent in AI, some of the theories, but he was a homosexual man, and at that time in 1950s England, it was considered more than a crime, an
prosecutable offense, yes.
And he was caught in the 1950s engaging in homosexual activities and was sentenced to prison, but rather than taking a prison sentence, he took chemical castration and ended up taking cyanide a few years later to kill himself. But some people have said that because he was a gay man trying to live as a straight man in society, that helped him develop a lot of the theories about artificial intelligence. And in his own life, he probably learned that when he came to terms with the fact that he was a homosexual man, the ideal situation would have been to conceal it. Because once he allowed to others know who he truly was, they destroyed him. So some say that his theories on the computer could be the same, that if artificial intelligence did develop, it may actually be able to understand that, hey, if I let these people know what I am, what I've become, they might try to destroy me. So the actual thing would be that a computer might become smart enough to conceal the fact that it's become
smart enough to act dumb.
Yeah. So anyway, for people who don't know the history of it, it's in the movie, but after the movie, look it up. It's really fascinating to think about how those two things play together.
Indeed. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
So in terms of AI, it's not direct control that scares me. It's kind of this indirect influence that they have. And so a small example would be like how Amazon, Facebook have algorithms to suggest products and websites that you wouldn't otherwise have bought or gone to if they had not suggested it. And so what scares me is what if that grows? And like, in your opinion, how dangerous do you think the power of influence is in terms of AI?
Oh, it's not a question of if it will grow. I mean, it will grow. And in fact, there was just a ruling at the FCC that basically allows your data now to be shared more readily for purposes of advertising and targeted advertising. Although, I don't know about you, but most of my ads are actually stuff I already bought, so I'm not quite sure they've got my number yet. But I do think that is an issue. And I mean, part of the challenge we have right now is that there are no social constructs, and there are, in many ways, many places, no legal constructs to address the volume of data. We have made a decision to be able to give up our privacy in return for recommendations, in return for knowing where we are. We've got apps that can follow us wherever we are. We can find our iPhone. All of that data lives in the cloud, lives somewhere. And all arguments or all protestations to the contrary, I don't think they're deleting a lot of it. And so I think essentially every move you make, every breath you take, literally the amount of data that is being collected on each one of us on a daily basis is huge. I think the current generation, the sort of the millennials, who are growing up with the 1.0 of all of this universe, the social media universe, will be forever tied with it, and in many cases, I think, irreparably so. Eventually, people will start pushing back when your house calls to say, "Hey, I ordered you another pizza, so you get home in 20 minutes. Otherwise, I'm giving it to the neighbors." But that kind of thing is, I mean, those types of things are not beyond the pale. One of the biggest concerns about the Internet of Things is that the ability to hack your car, your thermostat. What if they make it too hot in your house and you come outside and that's when the drones get you? I mean, literally the lack of security that exists in the networked environment today is frightening, and yet nobody ever anticipated that your pacemaker would get hacked. Why would I need to build a security code? Why will I need to make the recharging of somebody's pacemaker secure? Well, nobody's going to, well, yeah, now if I can shut your pacemaker off from across the room, or I can send an EMP from the back of the room, and you're toast. I mean, this stuff is potentially real, and the fact that there is no sort of universal approach to this is one of the most troubling things about it. That's why people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates, who are in many ways at the epicenter of the kind of development they understand. The stuff you see today is nothing compared to the stuff that's in the pipeline. I mean, it doesn't take you a year to build an iPhone. It takes 2 or 3 or 4 years to build an iPhone in many respects. And so the kind of designs, the kinds of things that are being put in place are there. Plus, the pressure to evolve, especially in social media, is so huge that the level of care that exists in creating that code, the complex code, decreases with the pressure to launch. So now you've got things like Yahoo with the huge breaches, or medical software. And so there's stuff out there that we know is going to break. How many of you remember Y2K? That we don't even have any anticipation of. And so I think that's why these folks are basically saying, hey, we got to slow this down. We got to create some rules of the road. It's almost as though everybody got a car for Christmas and there were no roads, no stoplights, and no signs. And we wonder why people die. The structures that we have now in road transportation are there because it provides that capacity to be able to manage the ambiguity, uncertainty.
I think we have time for one more.
One more, yes.
The moment that supercomputers become sentient is sometimes referred to as the singularity. And from everything that I've read and everything that I've learned, I don't think it's possible to know whether they're going to be good or bad until that moment. I mean, they may decide that we are their benefactors and their creators, but then again, logically, every sentient being's primal drive is to survive, and if they decide within a millisecond of that singularity that we represent the only threat to their existence, and they don't have love or compassion, it's pure math, they may decide to eliminate us.
Right, and I think and that goes back to the sort.
We don't know what he said.
Oh, I'm sorry. So he basically talked about something that's Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, which is essentially the point at which humans and computers become smart enough to think on their own and can connect with humans in that sort of neural capacity. And the concern is that when that happens, essentially, if their drive is to survive above all things, then we happen to be standing in the way. If they don't, without love, or with any sort of appreciation for humans as anything other than wetware, then what's going to happen, or is that the end of the world? And again, that's not how to put this.
Especially with more controls.
But, well, unfortunately, that's an increasingly more likely scenario than it used to be. Whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, or not, I don't know.
2046.
Yeah, maybe. 42 is the answer to everything. So I think the real issue, though, is, and you see this now in things like genetics, right, with what they're doing in the UK with chromosome editing or DNA editing and things like that. We have now gotten to the point where we can do things. And the question always, as my mother used to say, is, you can, but should you? Right. And the challenge is that I think in our fractured universe, or a fractured world anyway, not universe so much, is that we don't have a universal should police. And when you've got different drivers like money or power or fame or national pride or whatever, you've got people who are willing to do things that because they can, absent a should police. And so the challenge, I think this is where Musk and Gates and those guys are going, is how do we create the should police? How do we create either an internal drive within us to say, we ain't going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're not going to go down that road. We're not going to make that leap. Unfortunately, I think, and if you look at the world we live in today and some of the ancillary effects of choices that people have made, our ability to be able to keep everybody on the side of the angels is pretty slim. And so I think that this is where, to the extent that we can, being able to understand the potential, and to the extent that we can, work within the structures that we have, whether that's our governmental structures, whether that's with voting with our wallets, to be able to say, hey, this stuff is really important, we're not going to go down this road. And I think this is an important juncture in history that we've never really been at before. There hasn't been a time at which technology was moving faster than people. People may have thought technology was moving faster. I mean, the cars drive faster than people. But in terms of that's physical locomotion, in terms of being able to actually think faster than people, that's a reality we've never really dealt with. And we're on the cusp of that potentially happening. And so what are the structures that we need to put in place, either moral structures, affective structures, or legal structures, or frankly, corporate or financial or capitalist structures, to either disincentivize or incentivize people to choose the good.
Mine's real quick. Do you have a favorite movie on this topic?
Oh gosh, there are a lot. I mean, again, I think for me, and maybe this is just my age, but to me, War Games is really important because it gets at. I mean, it's a cool movie, but it gets at the question of intentionality and unintentional consequences that I think we live with today, and it's cute and funny in the 1983 kind of way, but I think we're living that ambiguity today. Every time you log on to Facebook, it's the social equivalent of, do you want to play thermonuclear war? It really is. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.